Welcome everyone to Preparing Your Board for Journey to Net Zero webinar. Just to remind you all, this event is being recorded today and will be available afterwards. If you have any question during the session, please use the Q&A function that you can see on the bottom of the screen, and we'll try to get as many of these we can during the Q&A session at the end. I'll now hand it over to the team that's presenting today and introduce themselves, starting with Hugh Jones, who's Managing Director Advisory at the Carbon Trust.
Great, thank you very much, Mega, and good afternoon to everybody on this webinar, preparing your board for the journey to net zero. So my name is Hugh Jones. I'm the Managing Director of the Carbon Trust Business Services team, and I'm here today with two other speakers. I'm going to just ask them to introduce themselves too.
Thanks, Hugh. Yep, my name's Alice Ainsworth. I'm a consultant at the Carbon Trust, also within the business services team, and I've been sort of a Route to Net Zero topic expert, and I've been developing the proposition around Route to Net Zero. So yeah, looking forward to our session today. And Vicky.
Hello, and lovely to meet you. I'm Vicky Moffat, Chief Executive of Chapter Zero. We've been working closely with the Carbon Trust as a partner since inception 3 years ago. Chapter Zero is a community of non-executive directors, chairs, and committee chairs. I've got a tickly voice today. And we are working with that group of non-executive directors to equip them for boardroom discussions and action on the impacts of climate change. We are part of the Climate Governance Initiative, and that is a global network of chapters, now, believe it or not, in 56 countries around the world, and that's grown over the last 3 years. In the UK, as you can see here, we have 2,400 members, largely representing the FTSE 350 in particular, as you can see there, and we do have 6 supporting chairs. What we do is events like this, briefings, webinars, masterclasses, and we focus on convening, curating, and community building for our audience. I would encourage you to join as members, which is easy to do and free of charge, by visiting our website, and also to invite your colleagues to join as well, because our research has shown that having more than 2 Chapter Zero members on the board will make your jobs easier. So thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Vicky. So if we could go to the next slide, thank you very much. I'm going to talk initially just about tiny bit about who we are before we get into the meat of the session. So for those of you who don't know us, Carbon Trust is a trusted independent organization, and we've been working for over 20 years dedicated to the field of climate change and helping to address it. We have a very specific mission, which is to accelerate the move to a decarbonized future. And we deliver our services on this directly to individual businesses as well as to public sector organizations. And we also sometimes work in larger programs, for example, on offshore wind technology acceleration or in support to startups in the field. In the business domain that you all represent, we work with several hundred companies each year, increasingly globally, although our origins are very much in the UK. And we work on areas ranging from today's emissions reduction to tomorrow's net zero transition planning. The contents for today on the next slide. And yes, you can see that we're going to talk about really why net zero is so important. Net zero is in many ways the unifying theme of climate action, specifically for for corporates, but also actually for governments. And we're going to talk something about that today, and also why it's really important that your net zero journey is a credible one. And we're going to, given the nature of your organization, we're going to put forward some questions that you may want to ask or consider in the boardroom, and finally talk about the Route to Net Zero standard, which is the primary way that we approach this issue with businesses. So starting on the question of why net zero matters. When I've been around quite a while now in this field, and when I used to talk about climate change going back sort of 10, 15 years, it was necessary to talk quite a lot about the science. But it's actually for a long time been the case that serious scientists do not doubt what's happening. And for a slightly less length of time, slightly shorter length of time, that media and politicians around the world have sort of moved on from doubting it. And the question now is sort of very much more around the impacts and what we can do about it. And even though global warming, global heating is around the 1.2 degrees mark now, we're really starting to feel those impacts in terms of the disruption. And that's here. And bearing in mind that the impacts are far greater at the poles of the world. We're really starting to see that every 1/10 of a degree makes a real difference to our society, to our prosperity. The planet will probably be fine, but this is really about sort of human outcomes and other sort of nature outcomes as well. You can see some statistics there talking about, for example, ice sheet loss, and in many ways the impacts that we're seeing are most felt just in terms of climate shocks and disruptions at the moment. But this is why the debate about 1.5 degrees, 2 degrees, or something else degrees is really, really important. You can see, excuse me, you can see there at the bottom of the slide there have been a number of steps forward in this area. There have been climate conferences for over 30 years now, but actually the one in Paris in 2015 was arguably the most significant of all, in that it led to a legally binding treaty where governments around the world committed to a tangible target. In this case, or at the time, it was 2 degrees with an aim to move towards 1.5 as a tighter target. And in fact, that has become the target as the consequences of climate change have become clearer. So this really was the backdrop for what became a framework for businesses, which, as we will discuss shortly, has sort of developed into net zero. And to the extent that today, 4,500 organizations, mainly large, but now increasingly including smaller ones, have made commitments to take action on science-based targets and net zero. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. This has also been backed up by various policy actions, including the EU Green Deal and quite a lot of legislation in the UK itself. And then, of course, by standards, which are necessary to make the activities in this area comparable and reliable. And we're going to talk a little bit more about why it's really important to be credible in what you're doing and claiming to have done. If you'd like to move to the next slide. We're really something that we've noticed, particularly in the last year, we are really in an era now of scrutiny on claims and what is often now known as greenwash. You can see just from some of the headlines, I won't take you through them all, but these are a function both of the complexity of climate change and all the different sort of aspects of it, but also does say something about the way that the media works. But as an organization, this is an absolute #1 priority for any business now, is to not fall foul of this kind of scrutiny, which is coming, initially perhaps from NGOs, but now much more general members of the public are interested. And as you'll see from the next slide, investors are really interested in this. So you could just move it on. Thank you. So what we are seeing right across, well, what used to be called green finance, which is increasingly becoming finance, investors are asking these questions. They're asking questions about what organizations are doing today, but increasingly they're looking at the risks that climate change poses to organizations for the future and what it does to their investability. And I think this is something that I doubt there's anybody in this audience who would not be affected by this kind of scrutiny. If you could move on, please. So as a short summary of, before we get into what net zero really is and what it involves, a short summary of why organizations need to do it. Well, firstly, it is definitely the case that almost any organization can make an important contribution to the fight against climate change. And that's because even if you're a small organization, perhaps with few emissions, you will be in a supply chain, a value chain, which is far bigger than that. On average, and we do a lot of work in this area, an organization has a certain footprint and impact, and it's upstream supply chain and it's downstream products or services in use after they've left after the companies sort of made them and sold them. The value chain upstream and downstream is normally between 60 and 95% of the overall impacts of an organization. What the company actually does in its own sort of four walls is between 5 and 40% in nearly all cases. So that's why every organization is part of a bigger whole. We've talked a little bit about reputation, and particularly the avoiding negative reputation in this area. We've talked about investors. If you look at the three along the bottom there, this isn't just about the here and now. This is actually about the fact that the world's going to really change. A lot of business models are already proving to be under threat, and some of the smartest innovators are looking at how they can actually move today to tomorrow's business model, as it were. A lot of companies are going to have to get out of what they're in, or at the very least do it in a very different way. So this isn't just about short-term emissions reduction. This is actually about fitness for purpose in the future. So net zero really is now part of really existential strategy in some cases, and certainly long-term planning in all cases. Also, there is a whole element of risk reduction through doing this, and the process of going through net zero, because it forces an organization to examine the risks that are posed to it by climate change. It inherently makes organizations more resilient. And then finally, and you're hearing a lot about this today in the news around future energy sources for the UK, for example. There is actually value, there is significant financial value in going green, as it were, in lots and lots of ways, not just in terms of the long-term cost curve of renewable power, but in other ways as well. So green business models as well will help organizations to reduce costs. So there's lots of reasons to be getting into net zero. If we could just move on to the next section. So we're going to talk now about what a robust net zero target sort of is and involves. And again, with apologies for anyone who's already got quite into this, I'm just going to spend a minute or two just going through a little bit of what net zero actually is all about technically. Next slide, please. Thank you. So going back to what's happened since the Paris conference in 2015, the initial upshot of that was the invention, if you like, or I should say the production of a framework, which is called the Science-Based Targets Framework. And that was all about organizations being able to understand their trajectory to reduce emissions quickly enough so that the overall effects of climate change can be mitigated as much as possible. And that SBTs you'll sometimes see, those are still very much out there, and a couple of thousand of organizations around the world have committed to science-based targets for the next 10 to 15 years. And I think Alice is going to talk a little bit about carbon scopes later, but I think suffice us to know this is a very much carbon accounting terminology. Scopes 1 and 2 are to do with essentially your own corporate emissions, and scope 3 is essentially to do with the value chain ones that I mentioned before. So the emissions of your suppliers and of your, if you like, your products in use as they pertain to what you do. So a sort of an allocation of those emissions. And remember, most companies' scope 3 is substantially larger than their scopes 1 and 2, and together that makes your emissions footprint. And what science-based targets and ultimately net zero are all about, and I'll come on to the definition of net zero in a moment. It's not just about reducing, it's about the trajectory with which you reduce. You have to reduce pretty quickly now. We all have to. Broadly, we have to halve, more than halve in some cases this decade, and we have to reduce by about 90% by the middle of the century the emissions that we currently have. And that's even after you factor in the growth that hopefully we will also be having, which sometimes brings more activity and could bring more emissions. So we have to have a trajectory that gets us steadily to 90% reduction. We can't afford to sort of do nothing much for 20 years and then do it all at the end. And what net zero is all about is a recognition that it's impossible to totally eradicate all emissions. There will always be hard to abate industrial processes. There will be functions like heavy goods transport, which is likely to still require some form of fossil fuel, even in the sort of mid of the century. So it's an acceptance that there will be a sort of a rump, a residual 10% of emissions, and what happens then is there will be a neutralization of those emissions by the time we get to the net zero target year. So again, to simplify, that will normally be around 2050. So the ask for net zero is organizations will take science-based target approach to scientifically reduce against a trajectory to get to 10% by 2050. And then in 2050 and from 2050 onwards, they will neutralize their residual emissions with essentially offsets, which I'll talk about in a moment, which remove carbon from the atmosphere. So it actually has the effect of net zero. There's very likely to be overshoot beyond 1.5 degrees. Well, there's inevitably going to be overshoot now beyond 1.5 degrees. So actually these technologies and nature-based solutions of neutralizing and sequestering carbon out of the atmosphere are going to be essential to get us to anywhere near, in fact, 1.5 degrees in the long run, which is where we need to be. So the point about everyone playing their part, organizations and indeed governments are going to net zero, that is required on a sort of additional basis, additive basis, I should say, for the whole, for all of us to get to net zero overall. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about some of the specifics of this. If you go to the next slide, please. Thank you. Yes, this slide sort of shows a little bit about what I mentioned earlier. The trajectory is being key to everything. So the near-term science-based targets, a number of you might have seen happening since about 2016 when they were the framework was first developed. They're the short-term targets, and what net zero sort of layers on top of that is a long-term target going all the way out to the target year. I should say that in some sectors like power sector, net zero targets need to be actually sooner. Net zero needs to be achieved around 2040, but it's safe to think about it as 2050 for most organizations. And then finally, I just want to cover a little bit about this concept of neutralization. So as you can see there, we get to point 4, which is the net zero year, and we have various ways, such as really well managed new afforestation, or some technology areas, which I'll show you on the slide in a moment, and that's what helps to remove the equivalent of the residual carbon CO2 emissions that these companies have. There is also a concept called Beyond Value Chain Mitigation, and that is shown there in point 3, so along the bottom. And I'm going to explain that in another term that you may have come across, the term of carbon neutrality and offsetting. So what's really important to get across is net zero is all about a trajectory of reducing emissions really aggressively by 90%, and at the very end, at the net zero year, to neutralize those with removal offsets, which are very specific types of offsets. I'll show you some examples in a moment. In addition to that, in addition to the net zero trajectory, organizations are encouraged to make further contributions by, for example, investing in avoided deforestation, good quality offsets beyond their value chain. And what we often see, and Carbon Trust has been involved in doing this in good quality cases, we often see organizations saying, I want this product to be carbon neutral, or sometimes I want my organization to be carbon neutral. That is, excuse me, not the same as net zero, it is in addition. So the way that works, it's not really about a trajectory, it's about looking at the whole footprint in a given year that's occurred in the past. So you might say my emissions from last year, or my product's emissions, life cycle emissions from last year, and there's the whole external standard to help people do this. But the organization will measure those emissions and will commit to reduce those emissions, and will purchase good quality offsets to the technical term, I think, is to compensate for those emissions. And through those offsets, additional funding goes to, for example, avoided deforestation project, or other renewables projects, or increasingly actually towards investments in carbon removals offset technologies. So a really important point to get across: net zero is not the same as carbon neutral. Carbon neutral only really works if it's done in addition. And then just finally, going to show you some examples of offsets. It's very much in the news at the moment. Our bottom line on offsets is it's actually a really important part of the solution, but they have to be proper offsets, so they're good quality that work. And we again urge organizations to really research what offsets they're looking to buy, to avoid getting mired in controversy. And there are just 3 examples here of how reductions work and how they kind of relate to offsets. So if in your own value chain you can see ways to reduce emissions, so for example, committing to renewable power, investing in new specific zero carbon or low carbon technologies, going into sort of electric vehicles, that's fundamentally a way to reduce the emissions within your own value chain, and that would really be in the emissions bucket. Where it's outside of your company and your value chain, this is where we're into the world of offsets. So and this is where it's really vital to be talking to good quality prevention of deforestation, etc. And that's sort of where carbon neutral products or organization certifications kick in. And then finally, we are moving very slowly but steadily from avoided emission offsets to removal offsets, which is of course where we are going to have to be by the time of net zero. But there aren't enough of those today to go round, and some of them are really quite involved technical or technology developments which need to go through several more cycles. So for example, direct air capture and storage, you can see there, bioenergy carbon capture and storage, you can see there, chemical weathering, and then some nature-based solutions such as biochar or afforestation, you can see there as well. So there's a lot of investment into each of those at the moment, which again organizations are encouraged to contribute to, which the plan is mean that when we get to the net zero dates around the middle of the century, there will be enough of these functioning to remove the residual CO2 from the atmosphere. So that was really the background. If you could just move forward, I'm going to hand over to my colleague Alice now, who's going to talk more specifically about what an individual net zero journey will look like. Alice.
Great, thanks you. And yeah, good afternoon, everyone. So yeah, during this next section, I'm going to build on the context and requirements of net zero targets to look at those key steps in a net zero journey. But of course, be mindful as we go through this that these are those kind of overall steps, and the exact steps for your organisation will vary depending on the maturity of your organisation, the sector in which you operate, that kind of thing. So if we start with the initial steps, the first thing you would be looking to do is, of course, set a net zero target. And in order to set a credible net zero target, you, of course, need to understand what your emissions look like today. So that first step would be measuring your company's global operational and value chain emissions. That's the scope 1, 2, and 3, which Hugh spoke to previously. Most large companies have done this at least for organisational emissions and are reporting on a year-on-year basis for scope 1 and 2. And we're seeing more and more companies measuring those full value chain emissions, which is the upstream and downstream impact of your operations in effect. Scope 3 is much more complex, but it's a real foundational step in setting meaningful targets. You really need to understand your baseline, of course, to be able to set a target and determine how much you need to reduce by to say that you are moving towards net zero. The next step then, following the measurement of your emissions, would be to set those net zero targets, and this would include a long-term science-based target. So you'd want to take into consideration the sector of your organisation or any other specific kind of organisational pathways and guidance to identify then the appropriate reduction pathway for your company that would need to be followed in both the short term and then also what that long-term pathway would look like for your net zero target. If a company has already set science-based targets, then it may be a slightly easier exercise because you'll have a short-term target already. But you'd want to review the ambition level of that target and ensure that it is 1.5 degree aligned. And then you'd want to calculate what your long-term target needs to be for that net zero by 2050 or potentially sooner, as Hugh mentioned previously, depending on the sector in which you operate. The third step then would be looking to address your residual emissions. Now, when it comes to setting the target, you just need to make that commitment to neutralise residual emissions in your target year. So there isn't a requirement within the net zero target to be kind of neutralising residual emissions from the outset of setting your target, but you do need to make a commitment to that neutralisation. And there's an expectation that you would engage, as you said, in that beyond value chain mitigation piece, which is effectively, yeah, more of your kind of carbon neutrality and looking at kind of how you could invest in the market to ensure kind of readiness for neutralisation by your target year. If we have a look then at some real world examples of what this might mean for companies. We have a food and drink sector example here, and you can see on the left hand side they've measured their operational carbon footprint, so those scope 1 and 2 emissions, and they can therefore identify the kind of largest contributors to their impact. So here it would be electricity, with important contributions as well from natural gas and refrigerants, and then to a lesser extent those other fuels such as it might be those used to power heavy machinery, for example. Because they've been able to measure it, they can therefore then use that as their baseline. And on the right-hand side, we can see what the target needs to be, what the trajectory therefore needs to be for reduction in line with a 1.5 degree pathway. And that would be equivalent to 4.2% absolute year-on-year reduction in emissions in this example. If we look at another example, and this one, we're not focusing on those operational emissions, on those scope 1 and 2, but actually we're looking at the full value chain of emissions. So this organisation is in the fashion and apparel sector. And you can see just from the categories that we've got listed on the left-hand side here, how much more complex this value chain footprinting piece is, and obviously it is therefore more challenging to measure. But you can see for this particular example, by far their largest area of impact is as a result of their purchased goods and services, and that will be raw materials that are purchasing and being used in the creation of their products. And then they've got other contributions from, for example, capital goods, transportation, and end of life as well. So that'll be, yeah, end of life treatment of any products sold. Again, having measured that Scope 3 impact, that can then be used as the baseline, and the modelling can be done to assess what the trajectory would look like to align with a 1.5 degree, or we've also got modelled here a well below 2 degree scenario. The steeper of the two lines, the green line there, is the 1.5 degree pathway, which is obviously the more ambitious and more rapidly reducing option. Setting the target is obviously just the first challenge in this space, and actually once you've set the target, and I think where we're seeing actually increasing scrutiny as well is, you know, great that you've set the target, but actually how do you intend to achieve that target, and are you being transparent about what you intend to do to achieve that target? So what you would first want to do is develop an action plan so you can identify where the most material contributions from your business activity lie, and in terms of your emissions impact, and therefore you can start to build your reduction plan around that to see, you know, where is there maybe some low-hanging fruit in terms of energy efficiency measures that you can implement, or where are there maybe innovations that are required, or kind of strategic business shifts that are needed in order to decarbonize those different areas of your value chain and of your operations. As part of that, and as the next step to that, you'd want to understand, obviously, what is this going to cost me? What is this going to cost our organization? So you'd want to develop an investment plan where you can obviously model, particularly for any CapEx investments, you can start to model potential energy savings, but you can also start to look at, you know, where you might have significant climate risks associated with particular business activities, maybe risk from carbon pricing, things like that. What would be the savings by investing now? What would the return on investment be in terms of avoiding any potential significant business impact from things like carbon pricing? And then your third step would be defining a strategy for neutralizing those residual emissions. So yeah, you're not paying for the neutralization of your residual emissions from when you set your target, but you would need to develop a plan to understand how, you know, what kind of offsets might you be looking to purchase to neutralize those residual emissions at your target year, and how can you support the development of the removals market to ensure its readiness for 2050? So where might you look to engage in beyond value chain mitigation, that kind of thing. And again, if we have a look at a couple of examples, you can see here we've got a packaging sector example where they've assessed their Scope 1 and 2 emissions profile. They've been able to identify actually which activities within the business are generating and having the most significant kind of impact on their Scope 1 and 2 emissions. And therefore they're able to identify various measures across different time horizons and with different paybacks for how they might go about decarbonising those business activities. So that might be through optimization of energy consuming activities, or kind of savings through insulation, things like that that we have here. And you can see that they've been able to put some estimated CapEx against those investments, which has enabled them to also look at what the ROI might be for them. Likewise, we have another example here from the food and drink sector, which they've undertaken a very similar exercise, but it's just been kind of presented in a slightly different way. So rather than looking and just having it in kind of a tabular format, they've actually modelled it against their science-based target trajectories as well. So they can see along the timeline how they might be looking to invest, at what points along the target trajectory would they be investing in these various measures, and what the energy savings might look like there. And then they've been able to model that against the energy cost savings to start having a better and clearer understanding of what the CapEx might look like against kind of return on investment. So those are sort of the three main steps of a credible net zero journey. So there's obviously setting the robust target, undertaking the work to really understand what that target means in practice for your business, where is innovation needed, where is capital investment needed, and then that third step around just identifying and understanding what your neutralization plan is. What we'll now move on to look at is how you can use your board positions to ensure that kind of the appropriate measures are in place for a company to both develop and also deliver on a credible net zero path. For this section, we've grouped the areas of questions into these three main themes. So the first being, is there a complete understanding of the emissions impact of your business activity? Second, do we know how we're going to reduce in line with our net zero targets? And then third, do we know where we are on our net zero journey? And crucially, do we know what the next steps look like on that journey towards net zero? These next steps, as I said previously, will really vary significantly across businesses, depending on the level of maturity of the company, and also, the sector that you operate in, the markets that you operate in, and the scale of your business as well. So when you're engaging the boards on which you sit with the need to kind of fully understand the emissions impact of the business, we come back to the question again of the scope 1, scope 2 and scope 3 emissions. So that the diagram on the right hand side here provides more detail as to what goes into each of those three categories. But as we've said in previous sections, scope 1 and 2 is much more focused around your operational emissions, such as from electricity consumed at directly owned and controlled sites, whereas scope 3 might be looking much more so at your indirect emissions, covering your full upstream and downstream business activities, the impact of the raw materials purchased, the impact of the goods sold, or any investments that might be held by your business. So the first question, it's obviously really vital to understand, is have we measured our full operational and value chain footprint? As I said previously, most organisations are at a point of being pretty comfortable with measuring and disclosing scope 1 and 2 emissions, but there's still kind of, I'd say, much more variable coverage when it comes to the scope 3 calculations, and having a full picture is really vital to setting credible reduction targets. The second question would be, are we confident in the accuracy of our footprint calculation and the associated emissions reductions progress? So you might be wanting to understand from the board, have those calculations been audited and verified by an independent third party? What checks and balances have we put in place to ensure that calculations are robust and in line with best practice? And that's really to avoid finding yourselves in a position where you've been reporting really strong progress on any emissions reduction targets, only to find out that actually there was a really material area of emission in your footprint or error in calculation that materially changes the picture that you've seen and also been communicating to key stakeholders as well. Our third question, and one that I'll speak to in more detail on the next slide, is have we considered our carbon footprint in the context of our business strategy and what impact this might have? So the strategic priorities of your business over the next 5 years and beyond can have a really significant impact on the potential carbon impact of your organisation. And it's really vital that this is well understood. And then the final question would be, are we updating and disclosing our operational and value chain carbon footprints annually? So this comes back to the need for transparency about the impact of the business, and to see this as it's not a kind of one-off exercise. It's really embedding carbon management and carbon measurement into your ongoing business activity and disclosing that on a regular basis. So in terms of a real world example of how business strategy might impact upon your carbon emissions reductions, we've got an example here from the automotive manufacturing sector, whereby they had a business plan to increase effectively their turnover by 5% year on year from when they were setting their baseline target. And we can see on the right hand side, if you extrapolated this out based on their carbon footprint at the time of their baseline, their footprint would also grow significantly, far above that science-based target trajectory line, which is the red line on the chart on the right-hand side there. So by understanding this right from the outset and being able to identify this at the point of target setting, they're therefore able to consider, when developing the reduction plans, how they could overcome and decouple business growth from carbon emissions effectively. So they'd be looking at finding innovative ways within their organisation and across their value chain to effectively enable business growth without causing kind of significant increases in their carbon footprint. We've also got an example here just to demonstrate why it's so important to measure the scope 3 impact of an organisation, and not only the scope 1 and 2. So here we have an example from the agricultural sector, and there's a really slim grey bar on the left-hand side of this chart, which is all of the scope 1 and 2 impact of this organisation. And you can see therefore that the scope 3 impact is like orders of magnitude more significant than anything that they were going to do in their operation when it comes to their operational carbon emissions. And if you're not calculating that and you're not disclosing it and you're not setting targets around it, then you're really opening yourselves up to significant criticism potentially, because there is much more awareness within the market now of actually how significant the impact of scope 3 and the indirect impact of organizations' operations are. And therefore you really want to make sure that you're capturing that and you're fully transparent and taking action to address the scope 3 impact as well as your own operations. So our next theme of questions is around exploring those key levers to decarbonisation. So our first question here is, have we identified the investments and innovations required to achieve a net zero target? So this comes back to that first step of developing a plan for decarbonisation. So you'd want to understand not only maybe the kind of initiatives that are available right now to support the decarbonisation of your business, but also what future innovation is required. Where are there areas which are currently hard to decarbonise, where maybe you need to be collaborating with others or investing in kind of new technologies to try to kind of develop a decarbonisation option in this area. We then want to understand, do we have the right financial and operational setup to then implement that carbon reduction strategy? So obviously it's all well and good having a lovely plan, but you need to understand how you're going to fund it. And there are various mechanisms that could be used also to generate funds for decarbonisation. So one mechanism that we see companies using sometimes is internal carbon pricing. So here on the third option, we've got the third question rather, we've got, have we considered whether carbon pricing can support the achievement of our carbon reduction targets? Carbon pricing can be used as a tool in a myriad of ways. One way is, to use it to generate funds internally for then reinvesting into decarbonisation or low carbon technologies. But it might also be used when maybe assessing investment decisions and looking at how viable that investment might be under different carbon pricing scenarios, looking out into the future as well. And then our fourth question is, have we reviewed the neutralisation options of greenhouse gas removals to achieve net zero and looked at the financial implications of those removals as well? And this again speaks to the previous point around and Hugh's outline of the various greenhouse gas removal options which are kind of in development as technologies at the moment, and the importance of recognising that at 2050 there is going to be, or prior, there's going to be a significant need for you as a business to purchase those greenhouse gas removals in order to neutralise that remaining sort of 10% of your footprint, and in order to support the readiness of the neutralisation market at that point in time. What can you be doing to invest in and build the marketplace there? So that's our kind of, our 4 key areas of questioning when it comes to those key levers for decarbonisation. And on the next slide, we've got, again, just some illustration of the kinds of thinking you might expect as a business to look into when it comes to operational carbon emissions. So you can see a bit of a hierarchy to be considered, whereby the first option is, and by far preferable, is obviously to avoid the need for that energy in the first place. Then you'd be looking at low carbon or no carbon options around, we've got examples here around renewable energy or other low carbon energy technologies. And then that last resort would be use of fossil fuels, offset to compensate, and explore innovations that are ongoing or required in order to decarbonise an area which is currently difficult to decarbonise for you. We've also got an example here, again, looking at the automotive manufacturing sector, where they've been able to model their baseline carbon footprint, they've factored in their growth projection, and then they've identified the various initiatives that they could implement across time to work towards their carbon reduction target. And what you're able to see is that there's effectively, by doing this, they're able to identify ahead of time if there's going to be issues around a gap to target. What we typically see with Scope 1 and 2 decarbonisation is that the reduction initiatives are much more sector agnostic. They focus on renewable electricity and energy efficiency measures. And we've got various examples up here on the slide, including the avoidance of natural gas for space heating. But if we look at a Scope 3 example, decarbonisation for Scope 3, what we find is that actually those value chain reduction activities are much more sector specific and can also be more challenging to implement. It's not something that you're kind of able to control yourselves. It might involve engagement with your supply chain. And you're also, and here on the slide, we've got the identification of quite a significant gap to target, which goes to reflect the fact that actually business model innovation is potentially needed here. Are there different kind of business strategy levers to be pulled to reduce the amount, the impact of your organisation, or what are the potential innovations that you could be exploring to decarbonise areas which are currently challenging? So here in our agriculture sector example, we've got moving to more sustainable materials, reduced meat and increasing those kind of dairy alternative lines, supporting those lower protein diets that we're obviously seeing kind of a significant increase in at the moment in various geographies, increasing efficiency in production, and that point around engaging with suppliers. So not only setting science-based targets yourself, but helping to drive the setting of science-based targets by your supply chain as well. And then our final group of questions is just around, do we understand where we are on the journey to net zero and what our next step should be? So the first one here is, who is ultimately accountable for ensuring emissions reductions, and that reduction performance is kind of incentivized through links with remuneration. Clear governance and responsibility frameworks are really vital to the success of any business activity. Obviously, people need to understand who it is that's driving this, and incentivizing through remuneration can often be an effective way of getting that kind of responsibility and drive through the workforce. Then we'd have, how will we inspire people to trust that we'll deliver on our climate ambition? And this speaks to the need, again, to be transparent, not just on your own carbon footprint and targets, but also on the strategy that you've developed to achieve reduction. So that's where we're seeing initiatives such as the TPT, Transition Plan initiative in the UK, where there's increasing request for disclosures on your strategy as well as your kind of targets and current impact. How can we communicate our progress inside and outside of the organisation? And this comes back to, once again, being more transparent, providing all of the detail which sits behind your targets, and also potentially seeking that external verification and assurance of your claim. So obtaining verification of your footprint, having your science-based targets approved, for example, by the SBTi, really helps to provide credibility in your claims. And then finally, have we identified our next actions to continue to progress on the journey to net zero? So again, this isn't a sort of one-off business activity. This is really an ongoing piece of work for you to be engaging with across the organisation. Net zero is a significant challenge and it's very complex. So having that understanding of what your actions, what those next actions should involve is obviously really important. And that takes us on to the final section, just around recognising, just around the need to recognise and respond to the complex challenges that business face around net zero. We have developed the Route to Net Zero standard, which I'll just touch on very briefly before we move on to Q&A. So the Route to Net Zero standard has really been developed to support corporates in planning the route map towards net zero and certifying that progress so that you can communicate with certainty to your stakeholders around where you are and what you intend to do as a next step. It builds on our kind of 20 years of expertise in this field, and what we'd be doing is helping organisations to measure and manage carbon emissions, inform carbon reduction strategies and align those targets for the future, and that would all be with advice from our kind of trusted experts at the Carbon Trust. It's split across 3 tiers to meet organisations wherever you are. So we've got taking action, advancing and leading. And at the taking action tier, you can see the requirements outlined on the slide here. We're looking at kind of measurement of scope 1 and 2 and business travel footprints, and some historical reductions in operational emissions. Whereas as you move through the tiers, we're expecting a wider boundary of measurement, including the full measurement of your scope 3 footprint, science-based targets and science-aligned reductions from advancing. And then for the leading tier, we would require a qualifying net zero target, and that full measurement of scope 3. And then what we'll be looking to do as well is introduce a scope 3 reduction requirement in future cycles as well, so that you can be sure that you're reducing across your full value chain impact. And then, so just to bring our session to a close, today we've looked at the importance of not only net zero, but also building credibility and trust in your climate commitments, what net zero truly means and the steps to get there. And hopefully we've provided you with some good examples which you can take forward into those boardroom conversations to help businesses critically assess where they are on the journey to net zero and ensure that climate commitments which are being communicated are robust and will get us to where we need to be to achieve net zero. So thank you very much for listening, and I think we'll open up now for any questions. I can see that, yeah, there are a number in the Q&A chat, so thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Alice, for such a clear run through of the issues around net zero. There are some questions. We've got a few minutes, so with your permission, I'm going to select and actually group some of the questions, and we're going to try to answer. I'm going to start with a bit of a zinger, actually, which is what are your views on the recent Guardian article casting doubt on the Verra standard for carbon offsetting? What do you consider to be credible offsetting options? Yes, that's a very tricky question. I'll just start by saying we are not an offset provider. So it's not our sort of area of core expertise, but clearly it's bound up in the whole area of carbon neutrality and will be very much a part of net zero in the future. We would say that it is important to take as objective a view as possible. And ultimately, I think the questions raised by that article, and there was another article recently about a company called South Pole and their offsets, The questions raised, particularly about the Vero one, they're quite technical questions, and they don't really raise questions about the process. They raise questions more about the technical measurement of basically of forestry carbon sequestration. So ultimately, the decision around offsets as a result of that article is probably a brand question for organizations rather than a reputational one, rather than a technical one. So we would say, if you're buying offsets, you really need to look into that from a brand point of view. You know, an extremely risk-averse option might be, for the time being, to think hard about any avoided deforestation offsets. But the fact is that there is nothing wrong with that as a class of offset. It is just, while this sort of technical question is being addressed, you might feel that there's a reason to look for different types of offsets, just from a risk reduction point of view. So other types of offsets, such as renewables, cook stoves, and probably the most common two outside of forestation offsets might be safer ground, but we would advise that any company to ultimately do their own research, because there's a lot of choice out there as to what you buy. Just to reiterate that the process of offsets is actually very clearly stewarded, and there is a very strict certification process which reviews offsets for all sorts of issues, such as leakage and double counting, and there are some very, very good quality offsets out there that can be found. The second question I'm going to quickly answer, and I'm going to ask if Alice and Vicky want to chime in here. I'm going to pull two questions together. The first one is, what tends to be the key question that starts to get boards engaged with net zero? And the second question is, are we seeing sufficient development in UK companies of their net zero plans? And what are the key hurdles that are perhaps preventing executive teams from doing more than they can? I will have a go at the second question, but first I'd just like to ask Alice and Vicky if they've got a view on what's engaging boards.
Yeah. Take the first one, Hugh, thank you. The thing about this question of how you get this inside non-exec boardrooms is, of course, it's very sector specific. But from what we're seeing at Chapter Zero, I would highlight 4 key areas. One is obviously regulation, because regulation is a lever, and we've spoken about that today. And boards really are needing to get across that. The second is actually thinking of this area not as a sort of a regulatory barrier, but in fact as a commercial and growth opportunity around business transformation. And I think we're in a phase now where this growth and commercial agenda is really starting to come through inside non-exec boardrooms. The next, number 3, is about risk and the risk committee. And particularly when we think about scope 3, because when you think, without wanting to be dramatic, about flood and famine and war, and if you think about the macroeconomic context and the geopolitical context and how that changes risk, that is a lever for change and for thinking and discussing this at the level of the boardroom. And the final one I want to give attention to is reputation and stakeholder engagement. And we're having huge interest from our non-executives around the question of reputation in this space, because businesses are more porous. They have to be much more transparent than they were 10 or 15 years ago. And inside that, there are all sorts of issues that the non-exec boardroom have to address. But I think finally, the real answer to the question is about changing the mindset of the non-executives and chairs and committee chairs, and them seeing the world differently as they come to understand the impacts of climate change for all of us.
Thank you very much, Vicky. And I would just add that when we see the clients that we work with, some of whom come to us for the Route to Net Zero standard approach, which Alice outlined, one of the key things that really gets companies on board is they have to buy into net zero at a board level. We have to socialize the feasibility of the plans with the board, and the board really have to stand behind them. So actually it becomes a corporate commitment, and we're seeing that time and again. That we're very much getting to the end now, but a question's been asked 3 times, same question, and I'm going to try and answer it in 20 seconds. Please, can you repeat the difference between net zero and carbon neutral? So I'm going to try and do this really quickly. Net zero is about the future. It's about a trajectory for tough reduction, and it gets you to the middle of the century, and then there's some neutralization at the end with removal offsets. That's net zero. It's about the future. Carbon neutral is actually about the past. It looks at your footprint or your product's footprint in a previous year, and it says, I'm going to purchase offsets. I'm going to purchase offsets to the to compensate for my emissions. That is not part of net zero. It's in addition to net zero. So I hope that's reasonably clear. We'd be very happy to answer questions through our website, through our client support team. There's plenty of information on both of those 2 topics. So thank you very much, everybody, for your attention today and your great questions, and on to Chapter Zero as well for bringing this audience together. And I'd like to say goodbye from all of us. Thank you.
Thank you.